Be good to be back in Leesburg. This we consider one of our home churches. We have several. This is certainly one of them. And Janice, thank you. Wonderful. Going to begin our service this morning by reading Matthew chapter 26. We're going to begin reading with verse 17. Matthew 26, beginning with verse 17. Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them. They prepared the Passover. When the evening had come, he sat down with the 12. And now as they were eating, he said, 'Assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me.' And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each of them began to say to him, 'Lord, is it I?' And he answered and said, 'He who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. The Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born.' Then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, 'Rabbi, is it I?'" Father, bless our service together this morning. In Jesus' name. The disciples were there with Jesus, ready for the Passover. But we want to focus on two of those disciples this morning. The first one we want to talk about was Peter. Peter was a fisherman. He had been brought to Christ by Andrew, his brother. His name had been Simon, but when Christ saw him, Christ read his character and told him that from that point on he would be called Cephas, or Peter, which is by interpretation a stone. Peter, I think, was probably much like some of us. By nature, he was impulsive. He seemed always to be speaking unadvisedly on the impulse of the moment. He was always ready to correct others and to speak his mind, sometimes even before thinking about what he said. Furthermore, he was impetuous, ready always to do something. I mean, let's get busy, let's get about this, even if it might be the wrong thing to do. Peter was ready to do it. He was ambitious. He was self-confident. He had quite an opinion of himself. He was rough, maybe even a little crude. Maybe that came from being a fisherman. But he possessed something that all of us here today need, and that was that he had a loving and sympathetic heart. And he loved his Lord. Judas is the other one that we want to focus on this morning. The other one of the 12. While Peter had been called by Christ, Judas had not been called by Christ. In fact, Judas had urged himself upon the group. He wanted to be one of the disciples. And so he urged himself upon the group. "See if you can't get me in. See if you won't, if the Lord will allow me also to be one of the disciples." But the disciples had recognized in Judas some very real qualities of leadership that could be an asset to the cause. And so they spoke up on behalf of Judas. They interceded with Christ in order to get Christ to allow Judas to become one of the disciples. Jesus called Peter, but he didn't call Judas. Judas himself. In fact, the disciples were anxious that Judas should be one of their number. Tradition has it that he was tall, that he was handsome, that he had a commanding He was a man of keen discernment. He was able to understand the things that were taking place around him. He knew what was happening. He understood the circumstances. And he demonstrated an executive ability and prided himself that when it came to financial, was made treasurer of the group. Judas was composed, self-assured, for a potential officer, seek a man that has the same qualities. Now, both Judas and Peter followed Jesus during the years of his ministry. Both of them had been taught by Christ. And both of them proclaimed that they loved Jesus above everything else. Peter had even declared, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Peter had said, "Though I should die with thee, yet will I not deny thee." Mark 14, verse 31. Boldly proclaimed, "I will follow you wherever you go, whatever you do, whatever you ask, I will be there. I will be your disciple." That night, spoke of his betrayal. Both of these men had reacted to the same question because both knew their own hearts. Lord, is it I? Am I the one who is going to betray you? And in fact, both of them betrayed Jesus. Jesus was ready for death. He said, "The Son of Man goeth as it is written of him." He knew his fate. He knew what was going to happen to him. He was familiar with the Old Testament that predicted his death. He knew that. In fact, Moses had prophesied in Genesis 3, verse 15, that the serpent would bruise the heel of God, and he knew that in Isaiah had pictured him as a suffering servant by whose stripes we all are healed. In fact, he even knew the time. Daniel had foretold the very time when it was going to happen. Daniel 9, verse 26. Christ knew all about it. He knew that he was going to suffer, and he knew that he was going to die. But to be betrayed by the very ones who claimed it to be his disciples, to be betrayed by those for whom he would die, that's a different story, a different picture. I claim to be his disciple. I declare that I will follow him forever, wherever, whatever. So I need to ask that same question, Lord, is it I? Am I the one who will or who has betrayed you? Is it I? When Peter asked that question, he did it innocently. He had absolutely no intentions of betraying Christ. In fact, he had confessed Jesus as the Son of God. He swore that he would die for him. And yet, when the right circumstances prevailed, Peter betrayed the Lord, not once, not twice, but betrayed him even 3 times. Am I a Peter in my witness? Am I? Do I make a profession of faith, but when the circumstances get tight, do I deny my Lord? When it comes to ethical standards, when it comes to biblical standards, when it comes to certain opportunities for a testimony, do I let those opportunities pass by because of what others might think? Am I a servant like Peter? A servant of the situation rather than a master of the circumstances? Am I a Peter? Lord, is it I? Among the 12, there were 2 that evening, but only one of those 2 was saved. To both of them, Jesus said, "Take and eat. This is my body." To both of them he gave the cup and said, "Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." And yet of those two, only one was saved. One died a terrible death. Lord, which one am I? Jesus refused the salvation that was offered to him that night. He refused to relinquish his pride. He refused to confess. He refused to repent. He refused to seek forgiveness. He refused to accept the bread and the cup that night. He rejected the remission of sins. He chose instead to cling to those sins and not allow Jesus to take them. But Peter confessed. Peter repented. He became converted and drank deeply from the life-giving cup and ate the bread of life, and he received the forgiveness of his sins. And we have the opportunity to do the same today. Lord, is it I? Touch our hearts, Father, we pray. May we answer that question in Jesus.